Monster Merchant is a first-person psychological horror game where you capture creatures, Pokemon style, and take them back to your home for selling. Full disclosure, today's game was sent to me by the developer and is available on Steam. Atmosphere. The game opens with a brief cutscene where one of the monsters hides behind a tree, shivering in fear, and immediately it's obvious that something's wrong. But as soon as the game starts, the tone changes wildly. All the way through the first catching phase, the game plays sickly sweet music as you throw catching cubes at the various monsters that happily bounce around on screen, and the game's sound effects, the bright colours, and the text are somehow tainted by that opening cutscene. It's pretty hard to forget what you saw. No matter how bubbly and bright the game itself is, it's also unavoidable that this is a horror game and something is inherently wrong with what you're doing. When you get home and load them into the back of the van is when the game really does its best to reinforce that feeling of guilt that lurks behind everything. The next catching phase, the sickly sweet music is gone, leaving you in unsettling silence as you again catch more monsters. As the game continues, the ambiguous nature of what's lurking behind the facade that you're looking at melts away. As you continue hunting for cute creatures in the ruins of a city, it's punctuated by disturbing cutscenes that leave you with snippets of information. The game feels wrong. You know you're doing something wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what is actually happening until it becomes all too clear. The post-reveal isn't quite as impactful as the build-up to the reveal, and your level of perception will definitely affect how much guilt you perceive, but it's a solidly unsettling feeling that's there for most of the game. But what sadly hurts it the most is the game's own gameplay. The elephant in the room is how tedious the actual catching phase is, with each catching session seriously stretching out the game's runtime and lasting around 6 to 15 minutes of throwing cubes depending on how lucky you are, since monsters can escape you, and the randomness of it can also be fairly frustrating. The game has an upgrade system that supposedly increases your chance of catching monsters, but this didn't really feel like it changed much of anything. The idea is solid, but the actual execution of the gameplay almost validates the events behind it. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. The game is disturbing in nature, but doesn't quite enter the realms of scary, with the conceptual realizations being about it for the game's legitimate frightening moments. And that can happen at any time during the game, and will impact people differently. The further you get into the game, the less it obscures these disturbing moments. The sound clip of a baby crying plays as you stuff another monster into the van. The story could be considered frightening in terms of the future it portrays, but again, this would be hit or miss depending on the player. There's very little in the game to say for sure is scary, and what is there is dependent on whether the player is impacted by it at all. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The music for the first catching phase is childlike, full of artificial wonder and joy. Harps and chimes float around the colourful backgrounds and it's extremely disarming. But when you return home, there's a reflective, sad piano waiting for you. Just like how the game stops the cute music after the first catching phase, the piano you hear eventually gives way to a haunting piece of reversed piano music. There are some other pieces throughout the game that play with an eerie drone that backs the first scene in the ruins, and generally the game's music is totally fine for the scenario it arrives in. The sound effects for catching phases are very arcade-like, lots of synth effects and chimes again, though there are some other effects like babies crying and the sound of walking through blood that were far more serious, though oddly mixed, sometimes too loud or scratchy or dead sounding since the game lacks reverb. The game's soundtrack was pretty good, but the sound effects you ended up hearing the most were a bit of a mixed bag. There wasn't any voice acting, and it didn't need any, though the game needed a bit of reverb to sell the environments a bit, and again, was lacking there. Lots of pros and cons, but very few of the cons really hurt the atmosphere. That's one Harry Mason. When the gore arrives, it's quite shocking, mainly because of the game's presentation up to that point. It stands out quite prominently with a pool of blood, with some low-poly viscera and brains sitting in the red liquid. It's raw, and without context, it's pretty disturbing. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. Monster Merchant follows an unnamed main character as they hunt monsters in a forest, to bring home and ship them off in a van for money. The game explains how to play it through the main character talking to themselves, making capturing monsters feel important, but thanks to the opening cutscene of the monster whimpering, you know there's way more to this than meets the eye. The flashbacks and cutscenes fill in the gaps. There's lots of things lurking around at home that are ominous and imply several things the story doesn't always tell you. The story itself is both horrifying and still somewhat murky once you realise what's going on. Certain details are for you as the player to fill in and are never specifically stated. It's a unique tale and it unravels itself quite well, if not for the long periods of catching. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. I was pleasantly surprised that Monster Merchant was as interesting as it was, but the catching sessions were incredibly dull after a while, with no real escape from them or way to make them less tedious. It's a shame that an idea that would have worked really well is tainted by its own gameplay. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I caught the monsters, I didn't let it get to me and advise you don't either. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Let's go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.